Well, good morning, everybody. It's Friday, April 2nd. We got by April Fool's Day without too many problems. Few tricks were played, but went okay. And this is the Ag Committee meeting. We'll be meeting from 9 until about 11:15, and we're dealing with H 434, the Ag Innovation Board that was sent over to us from the House. We did hear from the House members in regards to the bill, and we had a short meeting in regards to 434 last week, and we set some time aside to hear from other folks today. We had Julie Moore in and testified in regards to the bill because we thought that A&R was a little light represented on the panel, and she did send some suggestions and has talked with Carrie Jaguar from the agency in regards to that. We've had a few comments come in from others in response to the suggestions, and so we thought we would hear from more witnesses today and try to get, move the bill along. Not that we're going to vote it out today, but certainly, within the next week or two, we certainly, I'm certainly hoping anyways to move the bill forward, updating our pesticide advisory board to a more workable solution. So before we get started, I didn't know if any of you are on time restraints. We can work you up on the list, but otherwise we do have a list of witnesses, and we'll run through those, and if you have if you haven't got anything to say, well, you don't have to talk, but if you would like to offer something, we'd be glad to certainly to hear from you. The first, Steve, you're on the list at the top. So I was wondering, as a lawyer for the agency, do you have some comments in regards to the proposal?
Well, good morning, Senator Starr and members of the committee. It must have been a mistake to list me first, but I can I can try. So I am Steve Collier from the Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets, and the whole point from our perspective, and Carrie and Kanika are much better versed than I am, but is really just to update the Pesticide Advisory Council and to expand its role. And what we're trying to do is to build a broader coalition of interests and to focus obviously on pesticides, as the current advisory council does, but to expand that role. The current advisory council is primarily government and UVM employees. I think 9 out of the 11 current members fall within that rubric, and that's a very important piece to have on the advisory council. But we feel like we need to hear from more people than just government employees, and we really need to hear from people who are involved in agriculture in particular. And that's part of the desire to do this as well, is to move beyond just pesticides and to develop more in agriculture. And as I understand, and Carrie can correct me if I'm wrong, that pesticide use is primarily in agriculture, but that has not necessarily always been the focus of the current council. It has been part of it, but not as broad of a focus as we'd like it to be. So we're trying to build a council that can take, or a board that can take a more holistic approach of the uses of not only pesticides on farms, but other related issues, including obviously environmental concerns and water quality concerns and soil health. So there's a variety of things that have been included in this proposed board that will be broader than just evaluating pesticides, although obviously pesticide use and trying to diminish it where appropriate will remain an important objective of the board. But as an example, the new board would include 4 members who are directly involved in farm production. It would include a land conservation member as well as an environmental group member, and it would include a couple of specialists who would be addressing soil, who have expertise in soil and water quality management. So it's that kind of broader perspective beyond the governmental interest that we think will be helpful. And importantly, all of the governmental agencies who are currently on the Pesticide Advisory Council and UVM would be on this new board, with the exception of AOT. AOT is currently getting in.
Managed to clone himself.
That's a very intimidating tactic to have 2 chairs on one committee.
Yeah, I got it shut down anyways.
So our goal is to continue to focus on the important work of pesticides, but also to branch out into soil health, to recommendations for payment for ecosystem services for the Vermont Climate Council, to reduce plastics in farming, to incentivize practices that reduce the use and dependence on pesticides. So to actually create a reason for farmers to move on where appropriate, to evaluate biostimulants and whether or not those should be regulated, to explore developing marketing standards that might also create a further incentive for farmers. If there are farming standards that award for the consumer carbon capture or reducing or plastics use or promoting organic products, that might also create a further incentive to move to better practices. And then I think another important part of this board is that the board will be surveying farmers from every county in the state annually to try to evaluate ongoing farming practices and challenges. So the whole idea is just to know more, to have more resources at the disposal of the board, to be able to do pragmatic and effective, make pragmatic and effective recommendations to both the agency and to the legislature so that we can make useful changes. So that's the goal, that's the basis for doing this. And that's kind of my synopsis, I guess.
Yeah, well, thank you, Steve. Maddie, have you had an opportunity to look through the bill and have a perspective on it?
I do, yeah. Thank you so much. For the record, Maddie Kempner, Policy Director at NOFA Vermont. I have submitted some written comments to Linda, and she just let me know that those are up on the website, so y'all have those to reference. And I'll run through them. I'll try to be fairly quick, but I do have quite a few comments, including some specific recommendations, and I don't know if it would be helpful for you all to be looking at the bill language as I'm talking about specific sections, but overall, I will just say first, thank you for having me in to testify. I appreciate the opportunity very much. And we have also appreciated the opportunity to talk directly with some folks at the agency and with some other partners about this. And overall, we do support the creation of the Agricultural Innovation Board. We're really hoping that it can be kind of, as Steve mentioned, a framework for more inclusive and really systems-based conversations about the use of pesticides and other chemical inputs in farming systems in particular. And our hope is that this board will be structured and facilitated in such a way that also really allows meaningful conversations among people from all impacted communities regarding pesticide and fertilizer use on farms. And my impression, as having worked in the agricultural community for quite a few years now, is there's not necessarily one venue where those conversations are happening. So we really welcome that. Some general comments in terms of changes that we would like to see to the language as it's currently written. One is that some charges that are assigned to this board currently feel excessively broad, and we are specifically recommending that references to the Payment for Ecosystem Services Working Group and the Climate Council be struck, and I can point to those specifically where they are in the bill a little bit later. But I think what would make sense is that the board could be charged with reviewing existing studies and recommendations as they relate to pesticide and fertilizer use. And those, I gave a list of what those might include in my written testimony, but the Pollinator Protection Committee report that came out in 2017, for example, could be something that this board would look at again. There's an Agency of Ag report on farming practices that came out in 2019. So there are several, recommendations and studies from recent years that have already been conducted that this board would be really well positioned to take a closer look at and move those recommendations forward. We are also a little concerned with making sure that strong oversight of non-agricultural pesticide applications is maintained under this framework. And our understanding is that the agency really does primarily manage pesticide use, even non-agricultural pesticide use, but that the Agency of Natural Resources plays some role in that. And we think it would be really appropriate for authority and oversight of this board to be shared between the Agency of Agriculture and the Agency of Natural Resources, including the ability to designate certain seats on the board that are more related to areas of the Agency of Natural Resources expertise. And we have specific recommendations about some of those membership questions too. And then finally, in terms of general recommendations, we really feel like the board needs to more explicitly include expertise around the deleterious impacts of pesticides on both human health and the environment. The question of impacted communities, and I've said this on the House when I testified over there too, when it comes to pesticide and fertilizer use, the question of impacted communities is a little bit complicated. We certainly understand that farmers themselves are an impacted community regarding pesticide and fertilizer use, in that many farming systems, rely on those as part of their day-to-day operations. But impacted communities also really includes much more broadly human health and the environment. So we really want the board membership to reflect that. And then in terms of specific recommendations, I don't know if you want me to go through them or if you want to pull up the bill, but I don't know how you want me to do that, Senator Starr, if it's helpful for me to reference the bill or if you all have it in front of you.
Yeah, maybe Linda could pull it up on the screen, or you could.
I could certainly do that, or Linda may be able to just pull up, my comments.
Well, it'd be easier maybe if you did it.
Yeah, let me
Would
see.
it be easier for you, Maddie?
Might be easier for Linda if she's got it at her fingertips. I have my marked up version. Let me see if I can find the one passed by the House. I want to make sure I'm pulling up the right version if I'm going to do that.
Well, Linda, are you on?
Yes, it'll take me just a moment too, but I'll be happy to get that.
I can share some of the more general ones that are, less necessary to look at as we're going through them before Linda's able to pull that up. The first one is really, it's just within the statement of purpose. There are some lines that say, the Ag Innovation Board would make recommendations to the governor, et cetera, for coordinating the implementation of the recommendations of the Soil Health and PES Working Group, the Vermont Climate Council. We're recommending striking that in part because those boards are already underway and their recommendations, and I serve on the Soil Health and Payment for Ecosystem Services Working Group, and my impression is just that the recommendations coming out of those groups will be much broader and not necessarily, only directly related to the charges of this board. And given also that this board will only be meeting 4 times a year, I think it's really important that their charges stay relatively, clear and concise. So the language I'm referencing here is lines 7 through 11, which we're proposing to strike. And again, this is in my written testimony, so you can reference it later. And then if you go to, let's see, section A1, which is on page 2. Similar language exists there regarding the board reviewing and making recommendations. So under A1, you can see that language there. We're proposing that section is struck for the same reasons that I just mentioned. third is a little bit further down under A9, and that is on page 3, so sort of toward the bottom of page 3. A9 recommends that the board, this is under the board's creation, it's suggesting that the board explore developing standards for a Vermont agricultural marketing program that sets standards for carbon capture, plastics use, and organic product selection. And again, these are areas where other bodies already exist that do this work, including, you know, in terms of organic product selection. I'm not sure exactly what's intended by that language, but other entities already exist to set standards and assess products for use in organic production. And those include the Organic Materials Review Institute, or OMRI, and Vermont Organic Farmers, which is the certification program of NOFA Vermont, also has staff to help farmers with organic materials selection. So that sort of seems redundant and a little bit outside of the focus of this board. And then in terms of carbon capture on farms, that also is something that's really being looked at. And I think that will be addressed by the Soil Health and Payment for Ecosystem Services Working Group, and likely the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee on the Climate Council. So that just felt also a little bit outside of what we would imagine to be the appropriate and manageable scope of this board. In terms of membership, and this is section B1. So really the list of members starts at the top of page 4. I am really appreciative, and we as an organization are really appreciative, that there is listed here a member of the farming community who practices organic agriculture, and we do want to see that stay in. My only concern with that, and the way that it's written currently, and I will say it's difficult for me to want to argue against a farmer themselves serving on this board. My only concern with that is that if you choose, you know, one organic farmer from the state to serve on this board, they're really only going to be able to speak to, you know, the production challenges and the allowed materials and practices for their particular scope of production. So if you were to choose an organic dairy farmer, for example, they have a certain range of expertise about organic practices within dairy, but they're not necessarily going to be able to speak to the production challenges and the needs of vegetable farmers, or, you know, grazing livestock, like non-dairy grazing livestock or something like that. So one solution to that could be to list a staff member from Vermont Organic Farmers who could speak much more broadly to organic production around the state and different types of organic farming. And then a couple other things in terms of the board membership. We are uncomfortable, I will say, with the way that H is framed in terms of including a soil biologist or a certified crop consultant. And this, I think, was raised in one of your last meetings, but I think a soil biologist would be really appropriate because they can speak to, you know, the impacts of pesticide and fertilizer use and potentially other, you know, inputs on soil biology. A certified crop consultant is generally someone who works for a company and therefore may have a vested interest in maintaining, you know, some level of use of agrochemicals or inputs on farms. So we would recommend striking the certified crop consultant and just leaving that a soil biologist. And then we also would like to, we're not really sure what the intention was with L, which is a member of the public knowledgeable in agricultural water management, or with M, a representative from an organization involved in land conservation. Those don't seem, I mean, especially land conservation seems a little bit less relevant to the charges of this board. So we're recommending striking L and M. And then what we would like to see in their place is, and again, this is in my written testimony, we prefer to see a member of the public knowledgeable about human health impacts of pesticides, as that's not really specifically addressed in any of these other memberships. And then a representative of Vermont Fish and Wildlife, who I understand does currently have some jurisdiction over pesticide use in certain applications currently. And then a member of the public knowledgeable about wildlife and pollinator impacts of pesticides. Feels really important to sort of broaden that, you know, inclusion of impacted communities. And then I just have two more comments. One is in section C1, which is, let me find that for you. That's at the bottom of page, starting at the bottom of page 5. This is regarding the report that this board would submit annually to the General Assembly. And actually, sorry, at the top of page 6, the report has to include recommendations to assist farmers in reducing the use of and exposure to pesticides. We also want to see added there a reference to reducing the use of and reliance on synthetic nitrogen fertilizers. Fertilizer use is mentioned in both the statement of purpose and in section A2 as a charge of the board. So we feel like it is also appropriate to mention it here in that report. And then lastly, on section C3, which Steve also referenced earlier, this is just right below that on the same page, page 6. I really support the idea of this board serving or otherwise conducting public outreach to the farming community. But our sense here is that the language is just really vague, and we would recommend adding language specifying that the survey or otherwise, other forms of public outreach to farmers is specifically regarding current climatic pest and disease pressures and other production challenges related to the use of pesticides and fertilizers, just to make that charge a little bit more clear. And that's all.
Well, you've given us a pretty good load, I would say. No, and what we'll do, Maddie, is, when we start marking the bill up, we'll look all those recommendations over and figure out where and if we can use them. Are there any questions, Chris? Senator Pearson?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Maddie, last year when we worked on an early iteration of changing around the board, one of the conversations that sticks in my mind was the need for, I think the term of art is integrated pest management, somebody with expertise on how the various chemicals interact when they're being used together. Am I right? Is that still important? And do you see that handled here, or is that's one I think of when I think of the crop consultant, but I hear what you're saying about them being in the business, as it were.
Yeah, it's interesting. That's a good question, Senator Pearson. I don't specifically see integrated pest management mentioned here. I do think that integrated pest management is a little bit broader than the way you're describing it and can actually include non-chemical forms of pest management. And we sort of see that kind of on the spectrum from, conventional, really like input-based agriculture to organic. Integrated pest management can sort of be on the way from conventional to organic. And so it is a really helpful, it's really helpful to have particular expertise on that. That could come from a number of people. My impression is that expertise could come from a number of people that are listed currently in the membership of this board, including, any of the folks, and Carrie and Kanika can speak to this, but any of the folks that are from the Agency of Agriculture, someone from the UVM Center for Sustainable Agriculture could provide that expertise to some extent, and potentially even a soil biologist, depending on who you chose. So I don't necessarily know that you need to add another member to address that, but Carrie and Kanika also, or Jared might be able to speak to that as well.
Do you think it's worth calling out?
Carrie looks like he wants to respond to.
Yeah.
Senator Pearson, I think you're conflating two sort of topics, and they are both worth calling out. Integrated pest management is paramount in every sort of recommendation that comes out of the agency and built into the permitting programs that we currently have. But when you said integrated pest management and then sort of went down the path of studying the synergistic effects of different tank mixes, which wouldn't fall under IPM, but is something that I think the committee has heard before. And just to, while it's on my head, Maddie, a couple of the comments that Maddie made, specifically about A9, which would allow the agency to establish a program that was beyond what the National Organic Program currently supports. That was a request that originally came from NOFA or VOF, and if they're change their mind there, we're fine with that that going away. That was a sort of to assist NOFA in establishing higher standard for Vermont certified organic products. And if that's no longer a path that we want to go down, absolutely fine with not going down that path. And the certified crop consultant versus soil biologist, sitting in your committee, I guess a little over a year ago, you had a witness in that was Tom Eaton, and he's a certified crop consultant, and he was describing all the innovations that he's seeing in precision ag, some of the sort of infrared technology that gets used to deliver herbicide only where it's needed, not an entire field. And I just thought having expertise and knowledge about someone who sees that firsthand and bringing that to the table for the conversation is sort of what was behind the thought of a crop consultant type person. But and I'll stop there. The rest of the testimony that Maddie gave, I agree with, but I just wanted to speak to those particular points, and I'll let Kanika follow up with the other boards or other associations that are mentioned in the bill. It certainly wasn't to sort of usurp the work that they do, but just to make sure that we're not doing it twice.
Yeah, thank you, Carrie. Brian, you have a question?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I appreciate Maddie's testimony very much, but I understand what Carrie's saying too, and I would be in favor of leaving the certified crop consultant and maybe even adding a certified pesticide applicator. I mean, these are people that deal with the exact products that we're talking about and are well aware of the sort of revolution that's going on in that industry. And I think to draw on their expertise only makes sense. So I appreciate Carrie's comments too.
Yeah. Yeah, and just make a note, and when we start marking the bill up, we'll have certainly further discussions on that topic.
I think I just quickly, thank you, first of all, Carrie, for clarifying the organic product selection. I do know that that's been a conversation between VOF and the agency, so it's helpful to know that that is sort of what this language was getting at. I still sort of question whether that would be best done through this particular board, but also in terms of the crop consultant, what I would love to see if that does stay in, or if you make a recommendation or an addition like Senator Collmore is suggesting, I think that that should be really separate from a soil biologist who is specifically expert in soil biology, which frankly in the conversations around soil health, which are growing in Vermont, it's so exciting to see so much agreement across the ag community about the importance of soil health and wanting to support that. Soil biodiversity and biodiversity in general on farms is really something that I see getting lost as in those conversations. Even in the amazing work that UVM Extension has done around farming and climate change, they have not necessarily looked enough at biodiversity as a part of a whole, farming system, and as a response to the ecological crisis that we're facing. So I would really love to see the soil biologists kind of stand alone, I think, in that seat, because I don't think a crop consultant and a soil biologist would play the same role here. So that's all.
Yeah. Any other questions from the committee for Maddie? Senator Polina?
Yeah, I don't know if this is a fair question or not. I mean, it's fair, but it's a little different than what we've been talking about. We've been looking at this bill and looking at the participants and whatnot, but I want to ask a different kind, sort of the opposite question, which is, Maddie, when you think about an agricultural innovation board, what would you like to do it? What would you like it to do? When you hear that phrase, and we said, Maddie, what should an ag innovation board do? What do you think its priorities should be?
Well, that's a good question. I think that if you think of it that way, that would really, in my mind, expand the sort of universe of what this board might take on. I would be hesitant at this point in, just the state of sort of policymaking in Vermont around the future of agriculture to establish a board that did look at that broader universe in terms of different types of production that we should be seeing more of, addressing the huge transition that we're in the middle of in terms of, dairy farm turnovers and just farmers aging out of agriculture. So I could see an agricultural innovation board looking at a lot of really, broader issues within the agricultural community, but I don't think now is the right time to establish another board that would take that broad look, in that we already have, all of these other boards and commissions that are underway who are tasked with that. So I do think this board, the name is something that we've talked about as, it's a little bit hard to pin down, and in terms of, it feels like the name is a little bit broader than what this board is actually charged with doing. I guess I'll say that. But I wouldn't want to see the charges of this board broadened all that much right now, given the governor's commission that he's created and all these other boards that are doing that work.
Thanks.
Any other questions from committee? If not, we'll move on to Jared. It's good to see you this morning, Jared. I think first time we've met up this year.
First time this session, yes.
Yeah.
Good
Well,
morning,
welcome.
Mr. Chairman. Good morning, committee. Good to see you all. Well, I guess it's good to be seen because I've been following your discussions. But my name is Jared Carpenter, Lake Champlain Committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on H 434. Reflecting and watching your committee conversations on this so far, I think it's well reflected in what a lot of us think is the common sentiment was, this sounds like a good idea, but, and my comments are going to largely echo Maddie's, in that I think this is a good idea, but I think it needs some changes. We've needed, the state has needed a board to look at look at pesticide use more holistically. And I think Carrie has said this a couple of times, rather than just sort of specifically always looking at chlorpyrifos or glyphosates or one at the other, but what's the cumulative impact? What's the cumulative use, not just in agriculture, but what's the use in commercial use and residential use? And how does it all work together? Not just application to farm fields, but then when it hits the water supply, when it gets into drinking water, when it gets into other fields, when it's used in the sides of roads and in right of ways and areas like that. So I think this is a good idea for a board to sort of look at that more holistically. Maddie had alluded before, and I got the list up here. I mean, there's a number almost annually, actually it is annually. We get studies and work groups make recommendations, but nobody seems to be going through and pulling out those recommendations and sort of working them all together. I mean, there's the Farm to Plate report from 2021, the Vermont Agriculture and Food Systems Plan from 2020, the AAFM report on farming practices from 2019, the Exploration of Future of Vermont Agriculture by UVM and VHCB of 2018. There's a lot of reports. There's not a lot of integrating of what those recommendations are. So I think this is a good opportunity for a board to do that. And just echoing some of my main concerns, I think the charge is I agree, the charge is too broad. The PES working group and the Climate Coalition are going to come out with a really broad array of their own suggestions. Not just in pesticides, but all over. Now, maybe this group could isolate a few little pieces of that, but I think the Climate Council and the PES working group are probably going to need their own implementation boards and probably their own funding sources. Where if you look at the other charges and going in out of A1, but A2 through 8, they're really specific issues. There's pesticides, there's, where'd it go? So it's pesticides and synthetic fertilizers, pest control and management, treated articles, plastics. I mean, those are all very specific issues that all sort of interlock together. So I think it's appropriate for the board to look at 2 through 8, but not necessarily. I agree that A1 should be struck out and just focus on those other issues. And sort of moving along, the board membership, I think it should like I was just saying, not just focus on agriculture, but broader commercial and regulatory, commercial and residential uses. I think there needs to be more experts, not only in private healthcare, but in wildlife and fields of that nature. I don't have any specific changes like Maddie did, although I don't disagree with her recommendations either. It's I sort of look at it myself. I look at it this way. There's a lot of applicators and users of pesticides, but not necessarily a lot of experts on the impacts. I think of it this way. I've been driving a car for 30 years. That doesn't make me a mechanic. I know how to drive, but I don't know how to necessarily to get under the hood and know what makes it all work. So I think just, a farmer who's using pesticides doesn't necessarily make them an expert in the impacts of pesticides, especially cumulatively over a broad spectrum. And then finally, I would say, Maddie also mentioned this, there needs to be more of a role of the Agency of Natural Resources, reflecting of what I had said. And if that is something where I don't necessarily know if a co-chairmanship is more appropriate, splitting that role between AAFM and ANR, or maybe choosing, Agency of Agriculture picks half and Agency of Natural Resources from areas where they're more expertise, like somebody from wildlife, somebody from the Department of Fish and Wildlife. That would certainly be more appropriate if those were members to be chosen by the Agency of Natural Resources. So I think a split there would offer perspectives not only on the agricultural use, but also the other natural resources impacts on the use of pesticides. So, like I said, overall, I think this is a good idea. It's actually not that too much different from the conversation we had before we all left the building on S180, which was sort of an overhaul of groups of a board or a committee to sort of look at pesticides in a broader manner. So I think this is a good basis, but could use some changes. So those are my thoughts and comments, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Jared. Are there questions for Jared from members? I guess I have a question in regards to one of the issues, but the question is to Kerry, if he's still with us. The question: what about the broader look that Jared talked about pesticides being used in other areas besides ag? Do you folks look at that and how it adds to and takes away from our environment and in the damage, say, that it could cause?
So for the last 30 years, the work in statute of the agency has been establishing permit programs for those other uses, for rights-of-way uses, establishing parameters for lawn care, certifying and licensing and certifying, training those applicators. All of those other uses and permit programs, they currently have their day in court, if you will, annually. We have a public meeting of the advisory council where those permit applications are discussed publicly, and it's an opportunity for public comment. That's what the current VPAC meeting is for, an opportunity for public comment on those other uses that do get permitted. And we would propose those permit programs and the buffers and everything that's been built in over the last 30 years are still in regulations. We wouldn't be loosening sort of any of the guidance that's been given there. And the public comment would be done online in a docket type system instead of the half-day meeting that currently occurs around providing opportunity for public comment for those permits. And in conversations with, sorry, this is a little bit off topic, but in conversations with Secretary Moore, the discussion was that similar to what the Endangered Species Committee would use, we would establish scientific advisory panels that would produce reports for the council. So it would be an opportunity for other agents, engagement from other Agency of Natural Resources staff. I think it's a little bit of a misspeak to sort of suggest that Fish and Wildlife or other Agency of Natural Resources have any purview over pesticide use. They're primarily the users of pesticides in the state. Fish and Wildlife, almost all of their employees are certified applicators, so they can apply lampricide legally, and we grant them that certification and licensure to do that work. If the expertise in exposure, we would appreciate using in sort of a scientific advisory capacity that would provide comment to the board. The sort of issue of primacy of the Agency of Agriculture since 1972 has been the state lead agency for the control of pesticides. And that's sort of a process that we went through. It goes through a federal register process with EPA. And sort of the designation is the Agency of Ag has primacy for enforcement of pesticide use in Vermont. And it's not sort of a program like the Clean Water Act where EPA maintains that authority and then delegates it to the state. We have primacy over EPA for pesticide use in the state, and there aren't any other agencies that have that designation. So even when the Agency of Natural Resources issues an aquatic nuisance control permit for pesticide use in water, the Agency of Ag still has authority over the use of that product. So the use inspection occurs from our agents. The product gets registered by our agency, and the applicators are licensed by the Agency of Ag. So there's some parameters that the Agency of Natural Resources will put in there with regard to the amount that can be used in water, but the authority to regulate the use is at the Agency of Agriculture.
And you folks as well, you folks analyze, if somebody wants to register a new product, you're the ones that regulate whether or not that should be allowed to be used in Vermont and all the properties of that pesticide. You review that.
We do, and that's an in-house review, yes.
Yeah.
We make a registration decision in-house.
Yeah. Jared, did you have a?
Yeah, no, just whether or not A&R should have some statutory role is a conversation for another day, but I think that there needs to be experts on the board, on the panel, who can look at the cumulative impacts, not just in agriculture, but across the other sectors where they're used. And that was more my point.
Yeah, and we don't disagree with it at all, Jared. I just
Excellent.
I wish we had more of the expertise in the state, honestly.
Chris, Senator Pearson.
Thank you. I guess this is for Jared, but anybody. Is there any state that's doing this well, that's seen a decrease in chemicals on our lands over the last any number of years? I mean, any models, or are states hoping we'll do well?
I don't have an answer, Senator. It's a very good question. Of course, obviously that would be a good model for us to use if there was. Certainly something I can look into, unless Carrie knows, or Maddie or somebody else. Kanika.
I'll jump in really quickly, and I do participate on a national level. with EPA and the Association of American Pesticide Control Officials and the working committees, the SAFIRAG, or the State FIFRA Issues Research and Evaluation Group. There's 2 working committees. I've been the chair of that, and I would suggest that a lot of states are looking to Vermont. We are the state that's doing it well. With our pesticide monitoring program, we're primarily corn as an agricultural crop. We have sort of less atrazine runoff than any of the other corn states. You've given us authority to regulate treated articles. We have the seed committee to prevent sort of dicamba issues. We've changed the label on Milestone because of the compost and aminopyrrolate issue. A lot of other states, including Oregon and Washington, West Coast states, are looking to Vermont for leadership about pesticide regulation. So we are at the forefront of this. California has a staff of about 800 that are having less success than we are here in Vermont.
800 people.
Yes.
You can put that on your business card, Gary, doing the work of 800 Californians. Pound for pound, though, no state's going backwards on the amount of chemicals being applied. Is that a fact? Is that fair?
It isn't, Senator Pearson, because they adjust. We're constantly playing a game, whereas if people are looking at glyphosate, then they'll use glufosinate or dicamba. If we're looking at atrazine, they'll use sulfonylurea compounds. So what we're really trying to do with this board is create a model that incentivizes a shift in the paradigm of what productive agriculture means. And when Maddie was suggesting IPM as baby steps towards organic production, let's start taking those baby steps. I think most of our agriculture in the state does practice IPM, whether that's your orchards. We've got it built into golf course permit programs where you identify the pests, you identify the fungus before you treat. We limit the amount they can use, so they're forced down an IPM path in the golf course permit program. Let's incentivize, like you've created with water quality and the payment for ecosystem services. Let's incentivize that shift instead of vilify the current practices that are allowed. And that's sort of the premise behind this. It's this is everybody's state. This is our sandbox to play in. Let's have the conversations about agriculture that we've been avoiding as a group for so long. The conversations end up in your committee and we sit there and fight. I don't want to be the face that's defending glyphosate, trying to present you facts, but this is a conversation that needs to be broader than staff at the agency, which is why you see a lot of members on this board that aren't state employees. We want to take it out of that realm, put the power in the hands of the people.
Yeah, and I think, is it Kinka? Did you have a comment you wanted to make in regards to this?
Me?
Yeah.
Kanika? Hi.
Kanika?
I had a couple comments to make based on both what Jared and Maddie said. The first is that I think the legislative language might be confusing. The whole reason that we put in the reference to those other working groups was to make, like, the legislature comes up with these committees that propose policy solutions. And I think as a legislator, I imagine it would be very frustrating to have contradictory policy recommendations brought to the table when these are committees that you've created. So the idea was to make sure that we're working hand in hand with other committees that are doing similar work. So I'm not saying we're trying to take over what the climate committee is doing or anything like that. We want to make sure that anything we bring forward as the AIB is in line and in harmony with those other working groups that already exist. And I think Maddie and Jared both made great points that we should be looking at work that's historically been done and reports that have already been brought to light with recommendations. So I think that's something absolutely we should be doing. The second thing I want to clarify was that adding new people to the board just might not always make sense. I think when there are issues that are specific to fish and wildlife or to other areas that are very specific, when these issues come up, I think we want to have experts coming in talking on specific issues. So if someone has a very has a lot of expertise and a very nuanced perspective on specific issues, we would want them to come into the group and talk about those very specific issues. But if someone has a very narrow area of expertise, we want to capitalize on that, but it might not make sense for them to be on a board that's looking at a broad range of issues. The reason why the scope of the board is so, in theory, broad, but I actually think it's very specific, is to make sure that that the board is not, with vague language, the board could really look at anything or nothing. But with these specific charges, and make sure that the board's actually doing something. The last thing we want, personally, the last thing I want in the Agency of Agriculture is a board that meets and does nothing. That would be very frustrating for me and probably for all of you as well. So I want to make sure that the board's actually working to accomplish specific policy goals. Now, based on the language that Jared and Maddie recommended, I think we can definitely work to change some of the language. A lot of this was a draft to see where other people and other stakeholders were at. And then the final thing the final thing I want to mention was that when VPAC was created in 1986, times were different. Agriculture looked different. Pest control looked different. Pesticide use in general look different. And so what we want to do with this, a lot of it is just modernization, like the VPAC and increasing transparency. So VPAC currently, if you want to attend, you have to take half a day. You have to come be at the table to have this conversation. But if we posted these permits and made the permitting process available publicly for public comment over a long period of time, it would increase transparency and allow for more equity and inclusion for people who wanted to comment, so that the Secretary of Agriculture could read a variety of perspectives, not just those from people who work at state agencies or people who have the privilege to attend a half-day meeting. So those are some of the things I wanted to address. A lot of it is modernization, looking at specific charges to make sure that we're doing something, and to kind of take the time that the legislature doesn't have the privilege. Bills have to be out of one committee in a month and a half, essentially, and 2.5 months, I guess. But essentially, it's a way to get testimony, get a large group together, get a lot of expertise to the table, and bring you all a list of policy recommendations to look at. And so it's a way to actually get a lot more perspective and a lot more expertise over a year-long period, as opposed to a couple months like the legislature operates.
Well, thank you. It would certainly be nice to, for the different groups to try to come to a consensus before it gets to us. I think it would make our life much easier in the Senate, especially between our committee and natural resources. They're always, well, not always, but a lot of times there's conflicting testimony, and if we were sort of on the same page, just maybe instead of a different page, just a different line on the page, it would be much easier for us to deal with the issues. Do you feel that 4 meetings? We haven't got it limited to 4 meetings a year, do we? You have 4 meetings that you can meet, but couldn't you meet a 5th time if you needed to, or whatever?
Yes, I think that it's at least 4 meetings annually. And I think now that we have experienced Zoom and Teams and all these different virtual platforms, and we also have phones, we could meet more frequently and, do 4 times in person and then kind of a monthly 1-hour call or whatever to make sure that we're doing the work. But yes, the minimum is 4. That doesn't mean that has to be the maximum.
Yeah. Any other questions? Carrie, we had you on last to kind of sum up things. Did you have more to offer us in regards to what we, on the bill?
Not particularly, other than, Senator Perry, sorry.
All right. If he doesn't have anything to add, I was just going to add, I have a question for Carrie if he's not going to add. I asked it to Steve and Kanika last week, but really just want to get Carrie's take on it too. With this going into place, are there any other committees or boards that would fit under this? I think of like the seed trait committee, or do we start to create redundant pieces here? And, what else could we be doing to is there anything we kind of streamline this oversight? Are we creating pods that, where we have too many people looking at one issue or various boards looking at one issue?
So that seed trait committee, we would have used it had the courts not vacated the dicamba registration. If folks know what I'm talking about, I'll back that up. We were set to see a different herbicide tolerant corn seed come into the state, and that particular product caused issues all over the country with drift, and that dicamba would affect sort of some of the important crops that we do see near cornfields, like apples or grapes, for instance. That dicamba product would definitely very easily decimate a vineyard. And on the horizon, when that legislation was passed, we were set to see dicamba tolerant corn seed come into the state. The court vacated the registration of that over the top dicamba product. And so that put that product on hold for a year. We wanted to have an opportunity for the folks that would use that product, an opportunity to decide whether or not they wanted to accept that liability. So at the time, the pesticide applicators, the company who provided that product, that developed that trait, was leaving the liability on that of the pesticide applicator or the farmer to accept liability. And we wanted an opportunity for folks using that technology in the state to decide whether or not they wanted to accept that liability. We are back on track for not next year, but the year after, to see dicamba tolerant corn come in the state. And we can either keep the seed committee as is or give that authority to review whether or not that technology is appropriate in the state to this board. So with a little background, the short answer to your question is that seed committee authority could be given to this board.
Would it make sense to do so, just so that they're not,
so the seed committee sort of offers the opportunity for the folks that would be accepting that liability, the opportunity to say whether or not they're willing to accept that liability. Putting it on the board would also give the opportunity to the folks potentially affected negatively by that technology an opportunity to have input as well.
Any, all set, Corey?
Yep.
Any other questions for our panel this morning, our group of people? Graham, I see you're on. Did you have any questions that you'd like to ask or anything you'd like to present to the committee?
Thank you, Senator, and thank you, committee. Yes, this is Graham Unang-Strupanox, Policy Director at Rural Vermont. Yeah, I have some comments and questions. I think this is a bill we briefly had a chance to discuss with Kanika, I think this last fall or over the summer. And as an organization at rural Vermont, we haven't had as much time as we would like to develop a more detailed response. We don't have anything for you in writing today, but I have some comments just to deliver and some questions to ask. So I think similarly to Jared and Maddie, we have some concern about just the scope of the board and the scope of authority. I think it's one thing, and at the same time, I think we are all in agreement that a more holistic approach to pesticides makes sense. We have the Dairy Innovation Center now here, and it'd be great to have some more opportunities for innovation in non-dairy agriculture as well, and to have some entities tasked with exploring that. And at the same time, as folks have said, this currently could meet more than 4 times, it sounds like, but currently it's slugged meet 4 times. And the tasks are pretty broad, and they're very time-consuming tasks. When we're considering innovation in agriculture and practices in agriculture is one thing, but for the same board to have the regulatory authority around pesticides feels like sort of another thing. And you might actually want really different people on boards that have those different tasks. I think that the question Senator Pearson brought up and the response that Carrie did around, how are different states performing, not only different states, but how are different countries responding to pesticide use, and how are they actualizing goals or creating benchmarks or metrics for understanding their impacts and use and reduction, are important questions for a board like this to be able to answer. But again, to be able to explore questions like that and recommendations around that is different than having the authority to regulate pesticides with the same body. I'd be curious to hear more about these scientific advisory panels that Carrie's suggesting, which could inform the board. And just to go quickly through, again, when we're looking at the Payment for Ecosystem Working Group and the Vermont Climate Council, they will submit recommendations. I think part of our concern is seeing the part of this. I acknowledge what Kanika said is also true. It's helpful to have someone there sort of integrating everything. And at the same time, we recognize that would put this board in a sort of a unique position of privilege to sort of look at all those recommendations and then create their own set of recommendations that would then be put forth to the executive branch and the General Assembly. I have ag plastics. I mean, this is such a great thing to keep working on. And I know, Carrie, I attended at least one meeting of the Ag Plastics Working Group a couple of years ago. And I'm curious to know if that working group is still going, or if that working group, I believe, had a number of members from solid waste management districts and other places. And I wonder if that's sort of an advisory, scientific advisory committee that you see still existing that would be informing the plastics decisions of this group. And maybe I'll just give these questions and then you can respond after I provide everything. I agree with Maddie just in terms of developing standards for a Vermont agricultural marketing program. I know this committee and others have talked about, the potential for a Vermont brand, how that could be helpful to Vermont farmers, and not saying anything about whether or not that's, I think, the right thing to explore or not, but just that this committee, again, this sounds like a very big task for this committee to take on, as well as pesticides and plastics and other innovative practices. And I think another thing that may be worth looking at, if that stays in, is just that to articulate standards for quote unquote carbon capture, plastics use, et cetera, just be careful about what specific metrics or things you want to measure are put in statute. I'd be a little concerned that we would be reducing them, things like carbon and phosphorus as we have in the state, and avoiding, a more holistic perspective, which I think is what we all want to see here. I would, again, just dial in the difference between a soil biologist and a crop consultant. I agree that crop consultants have amazing perspective, just as applicators do, and they absolutely have a role to play. So one thing to have a role to play in helping folks understand the context and decision-making on farms, the cost of things, et cetera. It's another thing to have a role in a regulatory body around chemicals, which you are perhaps selling or advising people on the use of and that your job depends on. I'd be curious to hear more about the thinking behind the representative of an organization involved in land conservation and public knowledgeable in agricultural water management. I also think the task around surveying farmers from every county in the state to better help understand the current agricultural landscape. I'd just love to hear more about this survey effort. That also sounds like a significant effort. And I absolutely think this would be a great thing for the Agency of Agriculture to look into. I just want to hear more about it, and it sounds like a significant task. And of course, as we've said a number of times, like we would love to have a lot more aggregate data, especially on the economic impact of the non-dairy industry. We often hear economic presentations. I believe Diane Bachfeld this last summer presented to a joint committee hearing about the dairy economy to this past summer to the joint committee, as I was saying. And when we asked about economic numbers about the non-dairy community, she said that the agency really doesn't have any idea who these folks are. So I think a study around who these folks are and what their economic impacts are is really important to consider. I'm not sure if this is the best place for, if that's really the goal here. I agree with Maddie that we have just the consistency around reducing the use of and exposure to synthetic fertilizers. It's mentioned at a couple places in the bill. Let's just make sure it's mentioned throughout the bill, including in the recommendation. And in terms of other members to consider, I do agree that it seems like having some shared authority with A&R would make sense if the goal is to regulate pesticides. Another alternative is I really appreciated Senator Polina's question, what would we want to see an Ag Innovation Board look into and look like? And I think that would be an interesting place to start this conversation. This was more started at the end of how can we transform VPAC, Vermont Pesticide Advisory Council, to become to be more effective. And so those are two different questions, and it's not to say they're not related, but they're two different questions. And I feel like there's some conflation here between those that's tough for me to tease apart. Some other seats that we thought about were fish and wildlife, insect and pollinator health, human health and pesticides. We recognize that the Department of Health is given a seat, but that's perhaps different than someone with specific expertise in human health and pesticides or endocrine disruption. If this is going to be an innovation board, one of the folks testifying earlier said, maybe it was Steve Collier, that they did a great job here, I think, putting different members of the farming community on. I'm really excited to see a member of the dairy community, non-dairy, grass-based livestock, vegetable farmers. They really did do a great job trying to include different members of the farming community here. But if we're really going to explore innovative practices and innovation, I think that we also can look at practices which aren't very present in Vermont, but which globally are considered some of the most effective, like agroforestry, and maybe considering having an expert in agroforestry on the panel, for example. A farm worker representative, I think, would be a really important addition here. The farm workers are often exposed to pesticides, herbicides, and other potentially hazardous substances. So considering the role of a farm worker on the panel, I wondered about someone with an expertise in the history of ag policy. If this is going to be, there's a couple of charges here to this group, which are specifically about making recommendations to the legislature. And I think it would be interesting to have someone who had a perspective on the greater history of policy so that you could explore, why certain decisions have been made over time, how they've been made, and if there are other sort of if there are things to look at from a regulatory perspective, both at the state and national level, to explore in terms of innovation or effectively facilitating more innovation. So I think I'll leave it there for now. I'd love to hear about the sort of ag plastics working group and thinking about that from Carrie. That seemed like a great effort, and it sounds like that's being folded in here. And just a little bit more about those scientific advisory panels and whether or not they'll sort of be a committee structure underneath this board.
Well, thank you, Graham, for being with us this morning. I'm sure, the bottom group here as the top group, the bottom group would be presenting to the top group, the way I look at it. And as the bottom groups are formed, they could have maybe 3 groups here instead of just 2 that would be presenters to the innovation board, that are the experts in these subject areas. Are there questions from the committee for Graham, or any further comments for Graham? No. Well, if there's no other comments, we will be working hopefully next week again on the bill on a given day. We haven't set the schedule up yet for next week, but yeah, we plan to keep working and taking your suggestions and certainly discussing incorporating them into the bill as we move forward. So if there are no other questions, Jared.
Oh, just thank you, Mr. Chairman. And if it would be helpful for us to be in the proverbial committee room when you have the discussion, please let us know. Thanks so much.
Yeah, just keep a lookout on our on the computer at our webpage, and Linda posts our schedule usually sometime over the weekend or on Monday, I believe. And so that'll, we try to get that on our different days and what we've got coming up. So keep an eye out for that. And yeah, anytime. And if any of you would like to, get on where you can speak, whatever, you can get to the waiting room and we'll let you in. More the merrier. That's one thing about our new room. It's much larger, so we can all get there and hear each other.
I don't have to walk around Senator Collmore to try to get myself into that back corner anymore.
Yeah.
Senator Starr, just while it's fresh,
Yeah.
I think it's worth sharing with Graham some answers to the questions he's had. And the ag plastic piece, this folds into sort of the bill that you just sent the House about creating a residuals management program. This board would be able to inform the direction of the residuals management program as well. But I would like to let Kanika respond to some of the questions that Graham had, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Sure.
Thank you, Carrie. So Graham, just in terms of the Ag Plastics Working Group, we were getting underway, COVID hit, so we haven't been able to meet, but we do want to keep that going a little bit. The reason why plastics are in here was one of the major concerns brought up with the Agricultural Plastics Working Group was that having clean, dry plastic to recycle was a difficult feat. And so basically why we want this in here is that there were a lot of pesticide residues and unclean plastic being brought to the recycling program center when they tried that pilot program, and basically they ended up sending a lot of it to the landfill because it wasn't clean. So something we did want to look at was how pesticides and plastic go hand in hand. And one of the charges of the original VPAC was to look at residential pesticide disposal management. And so that's something that the agency is already doing, it's an internal program that we don't necessarily need more oversight on. It's a pretty successful program, I would say. And so in terms of plastics, I'm not sure if the working group I think the working group should continue to meet, but a lot of that knowledge transfer would also come under this because clean plastic is a big issue. And so that I hope kind of addresses your concern, but we will try to keep the working group going. It's just been a little bit slow right now. And then in terms of policy recommendations, my background is in policy, my master's is in policy. I think we have a bunch of people who also are frequently in the legislature and well-versed in policy, kind of at the table in theory, depending on who's sitting on the Ag Innovation Board. So I think we'll have policy people at the table, but I do think part of my work with this board and part of the agency's work with this board will be looking into historical policy decisions and how things are made, and looking at ways we can take from other countries and states and policies that are being implemented there. But I think that's a really good point and something that is very important to me personally, and I think a big focus of the group. So I don't think that there will be, well, I hope there won't be issues there, but yes, definitely having policy experts come in as witnesses to testify in front of the board will be important as well. Carrie, I don't know if, sorry.
Continue, go ahead.
I was finished. I just didn't know if Carrie had anything more to add.
Well, you know, we talked about dirty plastic for ever since, I guess it was started being used, and there's no way to clean that, I would presume. Have you looked into that, or is there any biodegradable plastics that farmers could be buying? Is that available? Is there anything along those lines?
So there is technology to clean plastic. It's not technology that we have in the state or in nearby states. There's a facility in Arkansas and a facility in Wisconsin. There was a facility in Quebec that shut down that could clean residuals off of plastic to be recycled into other products. But right now, those are the only two facilities that exist. It's very expensive infrastructure, and that's part of the challenge with agricultural plastics in general. And you had a second question.
Is there any biodegradable
right
plastics manufactured that we could be using?
So Maddie could speak to this more, but right now a lot of for example, organic vegetable growers have to use plastic mulch because OMRI, which is the kind of body that has a catalog of different organic, national standard organic approved products, doesn't actually have any other alternatives at this time in terms of biodegradable mulch, because a lot of to have the elasticity to make, bioplastics, as they're called, they do still have plastic and other chemicals in them, synthetic chemicals in them that don't currently comply with organic federal standards. But I'm not sure if Maddie has more to add.
Yeah, that's basically right, Kanika. There are products that exist, Senator Starr, that are biodegradable, bio-based mulch is what they're called, that would in theory replace black plastic. And our producers on the VOF side have been asking for a long time to be able to use those products because they really don't like having to cover acres of their farms with black plastic and then put that in the landfill every year. And so we have testified to the standards board that creates the national organic standards or makes recommendations about them, about the need and the desire for producers to be able to use that. But the standards right now are so strict that if a product isn't 100% bio-based, it's not allowed. And so we're trying to figure out how to get the national program to strike a balance between potentially some inclusion of synthetics and assessing the soil health impacts of these products as opposed to, in comparison or weighing that against, these acres and acres of black plastic being thrown away, which is obviously not great.
Yeah. So that's at the national level, though, that change would have to be made. Any other questions for any committee members of the panel that we have here this morning? If not, thanks a lot for being with us this morning, and we'll be sure that this gets on the list to work on next week as we move toward working on the different House bills that we have. So thanks to all the participants, and hopefully we'll see you next week someday.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, committee.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So committee, you want to take a little 10-minute break, and then we'll come back and discuss some other issues for next week's schedule.
Sure.
Carrie, did you have something?
I did, and it was a little bit of a curveball, but I know we're still live online here. And it may be a question for Mr. O'Grady or Mike. And that's in conversations with Secretary Moore in regard to the endangered species permit that she's being asked to issue. We were working through a process where we're going to require an adulticide permit for the mosquito control districts in our regulations. And Secretary Moore would appreciate if that happened faster. We're in the process of promulgating regs. Is it possible to put that in this bill, or have we missed an opportunity there? Mike, it would be in the pesticide regs. I don't know if it's appropriate to put it in this bill or a housekeeping bill, or if we've missed that opportunity. It would basically.
Well, Michael, if they're in a hurry to get it done, is there a bill that we sent to the Senate that they're going to send us back that we could load it into, or that would move it quicker?
I think they will move S102 in some form but there's been some advocates who have asked for changes to the registration of the feed supplements and our animal health products, etc. But I think they'll be able to work through that and get that bill passed. That's probably your best vehicle.
Okay. It doesn't speak to the pesticide chapter necessarily, but if that's okay, I'll talk with Carolyn.
There's also the miscellaneous ag bill that's in your committee.
That we have, yeah.
That you have, it's a miscellaneous ag bill, and pesticides are an ag issue, and so you could put it on that as well. I just need to get a little bit more clarity from Carrie. What does the secretary want? The secretary wants you to issue the adulticide permit for mosquito control, or
Correct.
does
right now we issue the districts a permit to apply larvicide to water, to apply larvicide by air, and we don't cover other than by certifying applicators. We don't permit the application of adulticide by truck.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, and you're in the process of amending the pesticide regulations, but it's going to take longer to do that than I get it. Yeah, what I would recommend is you do session law that it would allow the agency to issue a permit for mosquito control through aerial application of adulticide up until they amend their rules.
Okay.
And then as the point they amend their rules.
Oh, it wouldn't be their rules, Mike. It would be our rules.
I know it's your rules.
Yeah. Okay.
But they still have the aerial application of pesticide Clean Water Act general permit, but they have that general permit.
Correct, but this isn't aerial, it's truck mounted.
Okay, all right.
It's vehicle-based application of adulticide.
Sure, okay. So yeah, I could definitely work on language to make that happen, and I'd work with the agency and Carrie and Steve Kanika to do that.
Yeah, and if as long as nobody objects to germaneness, if you throw that on the on 102, or we can do it in the miscellaneous bill, which the miscellaneous bill, they wouldn't even be able to object, but
there's no germaneness issue there, no.
No, so, work, Carrie, you can work with Michael on putting some language together, and if it's gonna go on to 102, talk with Carolyn about putting it on there. If you want, if you've got until summer anyways, we can put it, I would expect the committee's gonna move the miscellaneous bill back to the House, and so we could add it on there.
Yep, very
Okay.
good.
Carrie, if you could just shoot me an email with what you want the authority to do, that would be great. And then I can work with that and I'll send it to you, Steve and Kanika.
Excellent. Thank you.
Okay, and Carrie, one quick question for you. Is the lab in Randolph, where do you get your THC level checked on hemp?
There are a few commercial labs around the state, or we're doing compliance checks at our lab as well. But if you wanted a fee-for-service lab that's not the agency, there's a lab in Colchester, Be Diagnostics, that's doing that work, fee-for-service. Or, like I said, we take samples in the field and check them at our lab for compliance.
Trevor Colby, the sheriff from Essex County. I gave him your name. He said that there's nothing on your webpage where to get that stuff tested. And I said, well, hell, the new lab is supposed to be able to do that. He's supposed to be calling you.
Okay, very good. And we do have a list of labs on our website. And it's probably buried in the hemp program, but I'll have a conversation with him and we may be able to just run that sample for him.
Yeah.
We have that for other law enforcement folks.
Very good.
Yeah.
Thanks. We'll come back at 10 minutes or so, committee, and pick up where we left off. And Michael, how much time have you got with us this morning? Well, we're back from our break, and I thought we would take and have Michael run through the miscellaneous ag bill for us, because I would expect next week we'll be back working on what the House sent us. So if you would, Michael, you could run through that.
Sure. So the as-passed version is on the General Assembly's website. It's H420. I know Senator Conmore has issues when sharing screen, so if you all can just follow along, is that okay?
Sure.
Okay. So Section 1 repeals the sunset on the on-farm personal slaughter exception. I think many of you were on the.
I'm sorry, Michael, what number was it? H what?
420.
Thank you.
Many of you were on the committee a few years ago when you authorized people to go to a farm, purchase an animal, and then conduct the slaughter of the animal on that farm without being a licensed or having an inspection. And that would qualify under the Federal Meat Inspection Act exemption for personal slaughter. But you put a sunset on that to see how it would work. And then you extended that sunset. And now the agency is recommending to just repeal the sunset. So on-farm slaughter would remain an authorized way for a person to do slaughter legally in the state. And so that's the first section. The second section.
Well, before you go on, Michael, did they expand the on-farm slaughter in any way?
No, there was it was a small discussion. It really more just a reference to the numbers, but there wasn't any proposal to change the numbers as they exist right now. And by the numbers, I mean the limitation on a farm. Farmers are not allowed to allow on-farm slaughter of more than a designated amount of animals in statute.
Yeah, make a note, guys, that we have talked about raising that limit to some degree, and so when we get back to it, we won't forget.
So should I move on?
Sure. Yeah.
Section 2 relates to the definition of livestock dealers. The agency regulates and registers livestock dealers in the state. But this is kind of akin to the old the backyard pet dealer issue. You don't need to get a livestock dealer license if you're buying and selling livestock for your own farm. So what people are doing is they're saying that they are just buying for their own farm, but then really are engaged in a livestock dealer business. So the agency wants to clarify the language. They first want to say that a livestock dealer is a person who is on their own account or for commission, goes from place to place, buying, selling, or transporting livestock, either directly or through online or remote transactions. And then they want to be clear that a livestock dealer is not a person who engages in farming, as that term, when they are buying, selling, or transporting livestock for the person's farm. And then they want to add in section 3 of the bill, they want to give the agency would have the authority to require a person who's circumventing the license requirements to get a license when they're doing that kind of backyard dealing. Does that all make sense to everyone?
No.
So I'm sorry, I didn't prepare notes for today,
No.
so I'm doing this all from memory and
No, that's fine, Michael. The only question I have is that is there a number? Do you recall if there's a number tied to the backyard dealer? Because a backyard dealer could sell 2 animals or 25 animals, and there should be a number attached to that or something to what a backyard dealer really is.
There isn't a number. It's really a discretionary authority for the secretary. And I drew this authority from, or this type of authority from land use law. It's something, for example, that's used in Act 250 when people try to avoid the 10-acre requirement in Act 250 by building 1 acre this year, 1 acre next year. This is the same kind of thing that's being done. They buy a cow, they bring it onto their farm for 2 days, and then they sell it to somebody else, right? Yeah. And it's going to be based on the facts, and the secretary would have to make that kind of investigation and factual determination. I don't think the secretary is going to be doing that for 1 or 2 animals a year. It's going to be, a pattern of circumvention. All right, yeah. So I'll move on. Section 4 relates to the Veterinary Loan Repayment Fund. I think that the state has a special fund in which it gives grants and loans to or it gives grants to veterinarians to pay off their educational loans as an incentive to bring veterinarians to the state. The agency is recommending some changes to make it more consistent with the federal program and to give the secretary some discretion in determining who is actually a veterinarian that's significantly dedicated to providing services for basically farm animals. So the first thing it does is it renames the program from the Vermont Large Animal Veterinarian Educational Loan Repayment Fund to the Vermont Food Animal Veterinarian Educational Loan Repayment Fund. Food animal is the term that the feds use, and that's why it's being changed from large animal to food animal. And then on page 5, sub C, the agency is given the discretion to provide the loan repayment awards to licensed qualified veterinarians who are significantly dedicated to treating food animals in the state. And the secretary has the discretion to determine the level of service that qualifies as significantly dedicated to treating food animals, and may establish eligibility requirements and may create program requirements for all fund recipients. The agency basically wants to set some sideboards on this about, a veterinarian that moves to the state and basically is treating one cow a year doesn't get to qualify for the loan repayment. They want to put some criteria in to focus this money on the people that are doing the work with large animals, food animals in the state.
So it's not to open it up. So somebody that works on the one cow, but is primarily a small animal.
Right.
It's to help it the other way.
Yep.
Well,
And then there's a definition of food animal that's added. It's drawn from the federal program. I won't go through that if you don't want me to, but
no, we've only got another 15 minutes or so,
Okay.
and you've only got another 12. So
Sure. So section 5 relates to the agency's weights and measure authority. I think you all know that the agency inspects and licenses scales and other weighing devices in the state. What they're doing, proposing, is to amend the definition of commercial weighing and measuring device. So the agency's authority for weights and measures is focused on the weights and measures that are used to provide a consumer a product. It's a consumer protection authority, so that people aren't paying for something or the weight of something incorrectly. They don't regulate scales that are within the business. So say you're a produce manufacturer and you're packing a package for that you are going to deliver to a grocery store for sale. The agency doesn't regulate the scale within that produce manufacturer's packing operation, right? That is something that they want to be clear that they don't regulate. They would regulate, and the Attorney General would regulate the mislabeling of that product if it was sold at retail. So you're not taking away enforcement authority over a misbranded package of spinach, but the agency doesn't want to have to license and regulate those scales within the business. So that's what this section does. It says section 5, a commercial weighing and measuring device shall not include a device within a plant or business used internally to determine the weight, measure, or count of any commodity or thing while manufacturing, processing, or preparing the commodity or thing for market. Similarly, they don't regulate pharmacy devices. That's an FDA regulation, and so that they're not going to regulate that. And they are going to not regulate postal service scales. Again, that's subject to federal regulation. And so they're being clear that they're not going to regulate the internal business scales or pharmacy scales or postage scales.
Yeah, Brian had a question.
Yeah, just really quickly. So what about the scales that are in a supermarket where you weigh your vegetables?
Those are used to provide a good directly to a consumer. So that is going to be regulated.
Okay.
Right. So the scale where you get your lunch meat, the scale at the fish counter, the meat counter, those are all scales that are used to provide a good to the consumer, and they will be regulated.
Yeah, Chris?
Michael, is the principle that the market sort of handles the back end? Like if I'm a store owner and my supplier's screwing me over, I will figure it out and deal with that, but then the state regulates the consumer protection. Is that basically?
That's basically it. And there are standards for if you've packaged a good and labeled it as having 16 ounces of something, and if you sell that and it only has 8 ounces, that's a violation of consumer protection law in the state. So it's something that the Attorney General has authority to enforce.
Yep.
And the Agency of Agriculture, they don't do a lot of it, but you know, when they go to grocery stores and they buy a bunch of stuff and they run it through the scales to see how everything's, they have in that process. It's not really in their regulation, but they have it in that activity. They've found things that have been mislabeled as packaged, and they've referred that. So that's not really their authority, but in their authority to check scales and running that stuff through the grocery stores. Mike Dwayne told me a story about that like 10 years ago. So
I know. In my other committee that I sit in, we were going through the AG's accounts that money he took in. 1.2 million income that they got from Dollar General, I think it was, for mislabeling and all that good stuff. So yeah. So they do their work. Okay, Michael.
the next section is section 6 that extends the life of the Payment for Ecosystems Working Group. They were supposed to expire on February 1st, 2022. They've asked for an additional year to do their work.
Yeah.
Section 7 was probably the most contentious part of the House bill. It changes, as you might remember, under the State Clean Water Act in 2015, you required custom applicators of manure and nutrients to be certified. The agency wants to change nutrients to agricultural waste. So it's persons applying manure or agricultural waste need to be certified. Well, the definition of agricultural waste is a pretty broad definition. It includes things like waste oil and pesticides, etc. And there was consternation among a couple of House members that farmers would now be able to land apply, or custom applicators would now be able to land apply. Let me get the definition. It's one of those ones where you're like, it's not logical for a farmer to land apply this because it's going to hurt their field. So
like spread oil on some fields. That'd be worse than atrazine.
Here we go. Means material originating or emanating from a farm that is determined by the secretary to be harmful to the waters of the state, including sediments, minerals, heavy metals, plant nutrients, pesticides, organic waste, animal mortalities, compost feed and crop debris, waste oils, pathogenic bacteria and viruses, thermal pollution, silage runoff, untreated milkhouse waste, and the other farm waste, as the term waste is defined in Title 10. So people were like, oh my God, the custom applicator is going to be land applying bacteria and waste oils, etc. And that's not going to happen. For a custom applicator needs to be applying according to a nutrient management plan. And nutrient management planning requirements, you can't land apply waste oil under nutrient management planning requirements. But the agency does want to use this definition because they want to have, they want to be clear that custom applicators can apply plant nutrients, which is defined under ag waste, and they can apply compost, right? Or because that's something that they should be able to apply. They can apply feed and crop debris because that's allowed under nutrient management plan to be landed. So they want to use this definition because it has a larger scope, but it's not going to be every single provision that's underneath this definition.
Yeah.
But Michael, there's a fee in here, correct?
There's what?
Is there a fee implication?
Yeah. They have to
no.
pay a license fee.
No, they don't.
They don't pay a license fee?
They don't pay. This is, one of the they don't pay a fee. When I first started as Ledge Council, agriculture did not pay fees, period. And except for the manufacturers of the products that were registered, like pesticides, but farmers didn't pay fees.
No.
And so this is in that same vein. A custom applicator is getting licensed, but they don't pay a fee.
Okay.
Thank you. I noticed Carrie is good at collecting new fees quietly. So
Yeah, $3 million.
It's the water quality requirements really inspired a change in that, and that since then it's really, I wouldn't say it's snowballed, but it's the practice has increased.
It's increased, yeah.
Yeah. So the next section is 8. Yeah. This is really just a typo from last year. It's a wrong cross-reference on page 10. And so that was just a technical fix. Then section 9, as you may remember from the CRF money that you awarded to the agency last year, they created a bunch of databases to move that money, and they want to be clear in the information collection and confidentiality section that information in those databases are protected under the confidentiality provision in Title VI. And generally what that confidentiality provision says is that all the information that the agency collects about farming from farmers, etc., it's public, except that when they make it public, they shall not disclose the identity of individual persons, households, or businesses from whom the information was obtained. So the information is provided, but it's provided in a general kind of aggregate way. And they want to be clear that the information in databases has that same level of treatment.
Yeah.
Then moving down on page 11 to section 10, it's the hemp chapter again. This is becoming an annual effort to maintain the state's hemp program. As you remember, in 2014, the state was authorized to run a pilot program by the feds for the cultivation and sale of hemp program products. In 2018, the federal farm bill authorized all states to regulate the sale and cultivation of hemp products subject to a USDA rule. And everybody thought that was great until the USDA issued its rule. And it became clear that it's going to be difficult for many farmers to actually cultivate hemp underneath the USDA rule standards. So, but one of the things that the USDA rule did, it said that the states that were operating pilot programs under the 2014 bill could continue to operate under that standard until last year was October 31st, and then it was moved to December 31st. And they're moving it again, the authority to operate the pilot program It's scheduled to go until January 1 of 2022 now. So Vermont gets another year to grow hemp under the pilot program. And the thought is hopefully the state will be able, and other states will be able to convince USDA to change its rule, which might be unlikely because they just finalized the rule a couple of months ago. And if the state doesn't convince USDA to change its rule, the state's probably going to give up its regulation of hemp and put it on USDA to regulate hemp cultivation in the state. So you're probably going to see another next year, you're probably going to see another piece of legislation addressing hemp. But the state's going to get another year to run the pilot program, and this section basically is added to the hemp chapter to say that that they will continue to run the pilot program until January 1, 2022. And then I actually need to go to Senate Natural now, if you don't mind. But Section 11 basically.
I'd rather keep you with us if you're going there to work on.
Well, I actually only have one more section, and it's
no,
about.
If you need to go, Michael, go for it.
It's about emergency planning. I think everyone knows that the state has a state emergency management plan. You may not know that pretty much every agency in the state is tasked with developing what's called an annex to that plan. So the Agency of Agriculture has an annex to the state emergency management plan that's intended to address agricultural things, that emergencies that arise with agriculture and how to respond to them. What Section 11 does is directs the Agency of Ag to update that Ag Annex in order to improve the capacity of the state to maintain a sufficient food supply during times of emergency. So what they're supposed to do is they're supposed to look at that plan and to look at ways to make sure that if there's disruption to the global or national food supply chain, again, like there was with the pandemic, that the state will be able to have feasible local production and distribution of food supply. So theoretically, it's a way for the state to build and ensure a local food supply chain that will be sufficient during times of emergency, but if it's available in times of emergency, it's likely going to be available in non-emergency time. So it's both a way to build a local food supply during emergency, but to also build that local food supply generally. And they're supposed to submit to you by January 15, 2022, their revisions to the annex, and basically any legislative amendments, policies, or other actions that are necessary in order to implement that Ag Annex. So next year, you should see kind of recommendations for how to build a local food supply chain.
Yeah, well, I would hope they already have that, but it'd be more official. Chris?
Well, just to point out, that might inform some ARPA investments, which is something we should keep our eye on.
Yeah, and it would probably qualify because if it's about emergency management or response to the COVID, you could probably make that money qualify.
Probably need food hubs in every county. Just
yeah.
There you go. Okay, I've got to run. Have a good weekend.
Michael. Have a good weekend. Yeah, you too. Take care. The only other thing, do any of you have any preference on what bills we work on next week from the House? We've got this one, which the miscellaneous bills I said prior will probably work through it, but kind of hang on to it toward the end. So in case we bump into, something that we want to add to it. We got the raw milk bill, humane officer bill, the innovation board we are dealing with. But the most controversial one is that raw milk bill. So we got that to fool with. And then the others, like the definition of agricultural land for current use, is pretty straight up. And the right to repair bill, we've still got that bill, Chris, that we might be able to fool with, to add on to, if we don't want to ship it alone, add it on the miscellaneous bill. So if you haven't got any preference, I'll work with Linda and we'll figure out a schedule and go from there. And I gotta give Bloomer a call. Corey and Anthony, the top three of us on my screen, Brian and Chris and I, before you jump back on, talked a little bit about S100 and Pro Tem and Brian Collmore, Brian Campion and Jane, they want to push the food bill with the Dr. Dinosaur numbers in it. And that, I didn't mind fooling with it when we were talking about doing the full universal meals program. But if they want to change it and chop it up, I want to, if possible, I want to move the S100 right to education, let them add that to the, change the bill, do a strike all or whatever, but to leave, I don't really care about doing that without having it be a universal meals program. So I'm going to try to get hold of Bloomer and see about if we move it to education, if it screws the process up or not. If it doesn't, I'll move it to education and let them do their ed thing with the ed department, and they can have that fight. I also, during that discussion with that crew last night, brought up the fact about, well, what about our part that we played a major role in, is the food, doing the bonuses if they buy certain amounts of food, local food. And Jane basically assured me that, we would take that up. Of course, that's why it got to the big bill to start with, because there's money involved there as well. But she assured me that if the bill moves, or our part will be taken up when we do the big bill anyway. So I said, well, I'll talk to you guys. I didn't think about moving it. They wanted me to do the amending, and I got to thinking about that during the night. It's not my freaking idea. Let Brian do it. So
I'm fine with that, Bobby.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm fine with it. So they would education would likely deal with the funding stuff, meaning through the Dr. Dinosaur thing, but they might also look at other changes in the bill, like maybe taking away the lunch part and just doing breakfast or something like that. Do you think they might do that?
Well, the bill that they were talking about last night is bring that whole crew from 300 and a few percent on down to where it stops now into the free area.
Okay.
I think it's gonna be a costly deal for them, but anyways, let them worry about that. Chris?
Well, just, the way we've worked on it this week without possessing it, I think is the safer route. But Bloomer will let you know if maybe we've already screwed ourselves on crossover. I don't know, but that is the concern. So
I think Becca made a deal with Jill, because they've got bills that haven't gotten to us yet too. So I don't know. I just.
In other words,
felt
we're here
that-
till July.
Pardon?
So in other words, we're here till July.
We hadn't better be.
We ain't gonna
I'm
make
not-
we're not getting out May 18th or whatever they say.
I'm not gonna spend next summer on a freaking Zoomer like we did last summer.